The crackle of the valve radio cuts through the smoky air of the dining room. It is December 11, 1936. Across the British Empire, families huddle around their wireless sets, the wood of their cabinets warm against the cold. In a small cottage in the Welsh valleys, a miner's wife holds her breath, her hand frozen above the teapot. In a sprawling bungalow in Mumbai, a retired colonial officer leans forward, adjusting the dial. They hear the clipped, sorrowful voice of the Prime Minister, but they are waiting for him, the king, or rather, the man who was their king just hours ago. Then the voice comes through. It is polished, upper class, but laced with a vulnerability never before heard from a British monarch. At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. The man once known as King Edward VII speaks not from a throne, but from a castle that has suddenly become his prison. He speaks of the woman he loves. He speaks of his brother, who now carries a world of weight upon his reluctant shoulders. He speaks of his own heart, making this decision the most serious of my life. His voice fades, a new sound emerges. It is not the roar of a crowd, but the quiet, deliberate clink of a stonemason's chisel in the frozen grounds of Windsor. Workers are hastily carving a new name into the ancient stone above a royal tomb. The name Edward is being struck out. A new name is being etched in its place, George. In that single, violent act of erasure, the fragile glass of the modern monarchy is cracked. The siege has begun, not from outside the palace walls, but from within. To understand the weight of the crown that sits uneasily upon their heads, we must walk with them through the fire that forged their prison. The rain falls hard on Fort Belvedere in the late autumn of 1936, turning the Surrey landscape into a smear of grey and green. Inside the sprawling, turreted home, the air is thick with cigarette smoke and the cloying scent of expensive perfume. A gramophone needle scratches its way through a jaunty American tune, but no one is dancing. They are waiting. David, as the king is known to his family, paces before the fireplace, his tall, slender frame casting a flickering shadow across the Persian rug. He is 42 years old, the most eligible bachelor in the world, and he is utterly, hopelessly in love. Across from him, Wallis Simpson sits rigid on a silk settee. Her lips are pressed into a thin, determined line. She is not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there is a sharp, electric intensity to her. She is an American, twice divorced, and the British establishment views her as a social climber of the most dangerous kind. To the king, she is his anchor, his confidant, the only person who speaks to him not as a sovereign, but as a man. "They won't accept it, David," she says, her voice low, cutting through the music. "Your mother, the Prime Minister, they will never accept me." He stops packing and looks at her. In his eyes, there is a desperate, almost childish longing. He has spent his life as the Prince of Wales, charming crowds, cutting ribbons, opening hospitals. He has been adored from a distance, but Wallis has adored him up close. She has listened to his frustrations with the stuffy court, his boredom with royal ritual. With her, he feels real. "Then let them try to stop me," he replies, his voice firm, but his hands betray him, trembling slightly as he reaches for a silver cigarette case. "I am the king." But even as he says the words, the walls of the room seem to press closer. Fort Belvedere is not a fortress. It is a cage disguised as a retreat. Beyond its walls, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the offices of Whitehall, a silent coup is already underway. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, a man with the weary face of a rural parson, has been watching. He has seen the American newspapers, the photographs of the King and Mrs. Simpson on a yacht in the Mediterranean. He has heard the whispers in the Commons. The Church of England, the very church of which the king is the supreme governor, will not sanction a marriage to a divorced woman. The choice Baldwin intends to make clear is absolute: the crown or the woman. Down the long, rain-slicked road from London, a black Daimler carries a man who embodies this impossible choice. He is Prince Albert, the Duke of York, known to his family as Bertie. He is the king's younger brother, and he is currently hunched in the back seat, his face pale, his hands clenching and unclenching. He is a man built for quietness, for a life of naval service and family, for the simple peace of his London home at 145 Piccadilly. He has a wife he adores, the vivacious Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and two young daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth, the latter a solemn, brown-eyed girl of 10 who loves horses and order. Bertie does not want to be here. He never wants to be where his brother is. David has always been the sun, Bertie, a distant, stammering moon. The car pulls up to the gates of Fort Belvedere. Bertie takes a deep, shuddering breath. He knows why he has been summoned. The abdication is no longer a whisper, it is a roar, and he is the only one who can catch the falling crown. As he steps out into the cold rain, he looks up at the lights glowing in the windows. He hears the faint, tinny sound of the gramophone. He thinks of his wife, his girls, the warm, safe life that is about to be incinerated. He does not walk toward the door. He walks toward his own execution. The interview between the brothers is a masterclass in emotional brutality. Bertie, his stammer worsening under the strain, begs David to reconsider. He reminds him of their father, the late King George V, who on his deathbed had prophesied with grim clarity, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months." David waves the memory away with a flick of his wrist. He talks of love, of modernity, of refusing to be a puppet king. He paints himself as a martyr to the old ways, a romantic hero crushed by a machine of protocol. But it is what David does not say that wounds Bertie most. There is a relief in his brother's eyes, a lightness. He is not losing a throne, he is escaping a life sentence, and he is handing that sentence to Bertie. "You'll be all right, Bertie," David says, clapping him on the shoulder with a casualness that borders on cruelty. "You've got Elizabeth. She'll be a marvelous queen." The words are meant as comfort, but they land like stones. Bertie returns to his wife that night a broken man. In the privacy of their bedroom at Piccadilly, he collapses into her arms and weeps. He tells her he cannot do it. He cannot speak without stumbling. He cannot carry the weight. He is not built for it. Elizabeth, the woman who would later become the iconic Queen Mother, holds him tight. Her own eyes are dry, but they burn with a fierce, protective fire. She knows the game now. She knows that if David leaves, her husband will be king, and her quiet life will become a public spectacle. But more than that, she knows that her husband needs her to be strong. She will become his shield. Across the country, the machinery of state grinds into action. Winston Churchill, then a backbench MP, pleads for time for the king to wait. But the newspapers, controlled by the titans of Fleet Street like Lord Beaverbrook, smell blood. They initially hold back on reporting the affair out of deference, but the public, fueled by American gossip columns, is beginning to murmur. The silence is more terrifying than the scandal. It is the quiet before the avalanche. On December 10, 1936, the instrument of abdication is signed. It is a cold, legal document devoid of emotion. 3 witnesses, David's 3 younger brothers, including Bertie, scratch their names beneath his. Bertie's hand shakes so badly the pen scratches the page. David, by contrast, signs with a flourish. It is the last royal act he will ever perform. That night, the former king makes one final broadcast to the nation. It is the scene we witnessed earlier. He speaks of Wallis, "the woman I love," and the world falls in love with him for it. He exits the stage to thunderous applause, a tragic hero sailing into exile. But in the wings, the real tragedy is just beginning. The new king, George VI, barely sleeps. The following morning, he stands before the Accession Council, a body of ancient dignitaries and politicians. The room is vast, cold, and hostile. He must read a declaration, a speech filled with complex words and weighty promises. He looks out at the sea of faces. He sees his mother, Queen Mary, her face a mask of stoic grief. He sees his wife, her eyes willing him forward. He opens his mouth. The words come slowly, painfully, but they come. He stammers on the first syllable, catches himself, and pushes through. Every pause is an agony, but he does not stop. He is no longer Bertie. He is the king. And in that room, with the ghosts of his ancestors glaring down from the gilded frames, the modern monarchy is born again, baptized not in holy water, but in the cold sweat of human fear. The crowning of George VI at Westminster Abbey on May 12, 1937, is a masterpiece of theatrical denial. The Abbey is a riot of color, crimson robes, gold embroidery, the flash of jewels that have traveled through centuries. The music soars toward the vaulted ceilings, carrying with it the hopes of an empire trying desperately to believe in fairy tales. But for the man at the center of it all, the ceremony is a blur of terror. The new king feels the weight of St. Edward's crown as it settles onto his head, not just the physical heft of solid gold, but the invisible weight of every monarch who has worn it before him. He thinks of his father, stern and demanding. He thinks of his brother, now exiled to France with Wallis, calling himself the Duke of Windsor, already planning a memoir that would betray family secrets for profit. And he thinks of the small face he glimpsed in the royal box as he processed down the aisle, his daughter Elizabeth, just 11 years old, watching him with those solemn, searching eyes. She sees everything, the slight tremor in her father's hands as he receives the orb and scepter, the way he grips the arm of the throne as if it might tip beneath him, the desperate glances he shoots toward her mother, who sits ramrod straight, her smile radiant but her knuckles white. Elizabeth does not understand the politics of abdication, not fully, but she understands this. Her father is afraid, and a king must never show fear. She files this lesson away in the quiet archive of her heart. Across London, in the empty rooms of Fort Belvedere, the dust settles on the furniture. The gramophone is silent. The American perfume has faded to a faint memory. The servants pack away the clothes of the man who was king, and already the groundskeepers are scrubbing the name Edward from the stonework. History is being erased with bleach and elbow grease. But the wound of the abdication does not heal so easily. It festers. In the drawing rooms of the aristocracy, there are those who still refer to Wallis Simpson as that woman and blame her for shattering the mystical bond between monarch and people. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, courtiers whisper about the new king's stammer, his fragility, his unsuitability for the role. They compare him, always unfavorably, to his glamorous, tragic brother. They do not see the steel in him yet. They do not understand that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous. And in a rented chateau in France, the Duke of Windsor paces before another fireplace, another bottle of champagne open on the table. Wallis watches him from across the room, her expression unreadable. He talks endlessly of his plans, his memoirs, his belief that the British people will one day call him back. She knows they will not. She has seen the cold fury in the eyes of the royal family, the institutional machinery that grinds on regardless of who stands in its path. They are ghosts now, haunting the margins of the world they once owned. Back in London, the new Queen, Elizabeth, soon to be known as the Queen Mother, begins her quiet work of reconstruction. She understands something her husband does not. The monarchy is not just a duty, it is a performance. And if the leading man struggles with his lines, the supporting cast must carry the show. She throws herself into public engagements with a warmth and charm that disarms even the harshest critics. She visits the East End, she speaks to factory workers, she holds barbies and laughs easily. She is building a reservoir of goodwill that will sustain her family through the coming storm. But even she cannot protect them from what is gathering on the horizon. In Germany, a madman with a toothbrush mustache is rattling sabers and marching troops into the Rhineland. In Spain, civil war rages as a dress rehearsal for a larger conflict. And in the palaces of Europe, kings and queens are watching their thrones crumble beneath them. The Windsors are not alone in their vulnerability. They are simply the most visible. George VI retreats to Buckingham Palace on the night of his coronation. The crowds have dispersed, the fireworks have faded, the streets are empty. He stands at a window, looking out at the lights of London, and feels the vast, terrifying distance between himself and the millions of lives he is now meant to protect. He thinks of his brother, free in France, and for a fleeting, shameful moment, he envies him. Then he feels a small hand slip into his. He looks down. Princess Elizabeth stands beside him, her nightgown peeking out beneath her robe. She does not speak. She simply stands with him, a sentinel too young for her post. In that silence, something passes between them, a transfer of purpose unspoken but absolute. She will not let him fall. And one day, when her turn comes, she will remember this night. She will remember that the crown is not a right, but a sentence. The air raid siren cuts through the London night like a blade. Its wail rises and falls, a mechanical scream that sends millions of people shuffling into the darkness, down into the earth, into the tunnels and shelters and underground stations that have become their second homes. It is September 7, 1940, and the Blitz has begun. In the East End, families huddle together on platforms meant for trains, their children wrapped in blankets, their possessions in paper bags. The walls tremble as the first bombs fall. The sound is apocalyptic, a rolling thunder that never stops, punctuated by the closer, sharper crumps that make the ground jump beneath them. A woman clutches her baby and recites the Lord's Prayer, her lips moving silently, her eyes fixed on the damp ceiling as if she might see through it, as if she might witness the sky falling. 6 miles away in Buckingham Palace, another family descends into their own shelter. It is not a tube station. It is a converted basement, reinforced with steel girders, furnished with worn sofas and faded chintz. But the walls shake just the same. The king helps his wife down the narrow stairs, his face pale but composed. Behind them come the girls, Elizabeth, now 14, and Margaret, just 10. They carry blankets and books, as if this were a camping trip, as if the world were not ending above their heads. The Queen Mother settles onto a sofa and lights a cigarette. Her hand trembles slightly, but her voice is steady. "I'm glad we've been bombed," she will say later, and the world will marvel at her defiance. But in the shelter that night, there is no bravado. There is only the thin veneer of duty stretched over raw animal fear. Elizabeth sits apart from the others, a book open in her lap but unread. She listens to the crump of the bombs, counting the seconds between the sound and the shudder. She has been trained her whole life to remain calm, to project serenity in the face of chaos. But she is also a teenager, and she is terrified. She thinks of the ponies she left behind at Windsor, of her bedroom with its flowered wallpaper, of the life that is being erased one explosion at a time. The king paces. He cannot sit still. The stammer that has plagued him since childhood threatens to return, lurking at the back of his throat. He thinks of his brother in France, living in luxury, dining on champagne while London burns. He thinks of the millions of his subjects who have no steel girders above their heads, no sofas to sit on. He thinks of the men in the RAF, barely older than children, who climb into wooden and canvas planes each night to duel with death among the stars. And he thinks of the radio. Tomorrow he must speak to the nation again. He must find words that matter, words that comfort, words that do not betray the terror in his heart. He has been working with a speech therapist named Lionel Logg for years now, learning to breathe, to pause, to trick his own tongue into obedience. But no amount of practice prepares a man to speak for a nation under siege. The all-clear sounds at dawn. They climb back up into the light. The palace is still standing, but the city beyond its walls is smoking. The king insists on going out, on walking the streets, on seeing for himself. His advisors protest. It is not safe. There may be unexploded bombs, but he goes anyway. He walks through streets that are no longer streets, past houses that are no longer houses. He steps over hoses and rubble, past firemen who have been fighting flames all night, past rescue workers digging with their bare hands. A woman sees him, her face streaked with soot and tears. She stops, stares, and then, improbably, she curtsies. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she says. The king does not know what to say. He wants to thank her for enduring, for surviving, for curtsying in the ruins of her life. But the words will not come. He nods and moves on, and the image of that woman's face burns itself into his memory. This is what it means to be king. Not the crown, not the throne, this. By the winter of 1940, the bombing has become routine. The people of London develop a grim rhythm to their lives. Work by day, shelter by night, emerge at dawn to count the damage and the dead. The royal family remains in London, refusing all suggestions that they evacuate to Canada or to the countryside. The Queen Mother's declaration, "The children will not leave unless I do. I shall not leave unless their father does, and the king will not leave," becomes scripture, repeated in newspapers and newsreels across the free world. But staying is not the same as surviving. On September 13, the war comes directly to their doorstep. A German bomber, perhaps lost, perhaps lucky, releases its payload over the palace. 5 high-explosive bombs fall in quick succession. One lands in the courtyard, just yards from the king's study. Another destroys the palace chapel. Glass shatters, masonry crashes, and for a moment the ancient walls seem to breathe. The king and queen are in the palace when it happens. They throw themselves to the floor, covering their heads, feeling the building shake around them like a beast in its death throes. When the dust settles, they rise and look at each other. Neither is injured, but something has changed. The Queen Mother, brushing dust from her coat, allows herself a thin smile. "Now we can look the East End in the face," she says. It is a remarkable statement, and it reveals the strange calculus of survival. The monarchy has always been separate, aloof, protected, but the bombs have democratized danger. If the palace can bleed, if the king can cower, then the distance between throne and slum has finally collapsed. The Windsors are no longer symbols standing above the nation. They are fellow travelers walking through the same fire. Princess Elizabeth watches her parents emerge from the damaged palace, their clothes dusty but their heads high. The newsreel cameras capture the moment, the king in his admiral's uniform, the queen in her fur-collared coat, picking their way through the rubble with the careful grace of people who know they are being watched. Elizabeth stands to one side, her face unreadable. She is learning another lesson. Disaster must be managed. Grief must be performed. The show must always go on. At Christmas, the king delivers his broadcast from a room in Sandringham that has been stripped of its grandeur. He speaks of the old year and the new year, of sacrifice and hope, of the children who have been sent away from their parents to safe houses in the countryside. His voice falters only slightly. Millions listen, huddled around their wireless sets, and they hear not a king but a father, not a monarch but a man. But the war demands more than words. It demands blood, and as the conflict grinds on, the royal family must decide how much of their own blood they are willing to spill. In 1942, the king's youngest brother, the Duke of Kent, dies in a plane crash while on active service. He is flying a Sunderland flying boat to Iceland when it slams into a hillside in bad weather. The news reaches the palace in the middle of the night. The king takes the call himself, listens in silence, and then walks to his wife's room to tell her that another piece of their family has been torn away. The Duke of Kent was not a central figure in the royal drama. He was glamorous, slightly reckless, married to a Greek princess, father of young children, but his death brings the war home in a way that bombs on the palace could not. This is not symbolic danger. This is real, final, absolute. The monarchy is paying the same price as every other family in Britain, and in paying it, they earn something that no amount of pageantry could buy, the unspoken bond of shared grief. Princess Elizabeth is 16 now. She watches her aunt, the new Duchess of Kent, veiled in black, leading her young children through the funeral service. She watches her father's face, grey with exhaustion and sorrow. She watches the nation mourn a prince they barely knew simply because he was theirs, and she understands with the cold clarity of adolescence that her life is not her own. She belongs to them, and one day she will have to prove it. In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe ends. The news breaks on May 8, and London explodes into celebration. The streets fill with people, soldiers on leave, factory workers, housewives, children, all surging toward the palace, toward the symbol of their survival. They wave flags, they sing, they cry, they dance. They want to see the king. They want to see the queen. They want to see the princesses. The royal family appears on the balcony, not once but 8 times throughout the day. The king wears his naval uniform, the queen a pale blue dress that seems to glow in the spring light. Margaret, now 14, bounces with excitement. Elizabeth, just 19, stands still, her hands clasped, her face composed. But inside, she is trembling with something she has never felt before, the raw, electric current of being loved by a crowd. Later that night, she does something unprecedented. She asks permission to go out into the streets, to join the crowds, to be anonymous for just a few hours. Her parents hesitate. It is not safe, it is not proper, it is not done, but they cannot refuse her. The war has changed the rules. And so, Elizabeth and Margaret, accompanied by a small group of young officers and ladies-in-waiting, slip out of the palace through a side door and into the celebrating city. They link arms with strangers. They sing Roll Out the Barrel and the Lambeth Walk. They weave through the crowds, pushed and pulled by the tide of joy. For a few hours, Elizabeth is not the heir to the throne. She is just a young woman in an ATS uniform, her hair uncovered, her face flushed with excitement and exertion. She watches a soldier kiss his girlfriend, and she looks away, embarrassed and fascinated. She tastes freedom just for a moment, and it is sweeter than anything she has ever known. But the night ends, dawn approaches, the crowds thin, and Elizabeth must return to the palace, must climb back into her gilded cage. She walks through the gates, past the guards who pretend not to see her, and up the stairs to her room. She stands at the window and watches the last revelers stagger home. She thinks of the soldier and his girlfriend. She thinks of the stranger who hugged her, not knowing who she was. She thinks of the life she will never have. The war has forged her, as it has forged her nation, but it has also sealed her fate. She has seen what lies outside the palace walls, and she knows she can never truly be part of it. She is the heir, she is the future, she is the next sacrifice. In the years that follow, the world will change faster than anyone could have imagined. The empire will crumble. The certainties of the pre-war years will dissolve into the ambiguities of the atomic age. And a young princess will fall in love with a handsome naval officer, a man of restless energy and sharp wit, a man who will spend the rest of his life walking 2 steps behind her. But for now, on this night of victory and loss, Elizabeth stands at her window and watches the dawn break over a city that has survived. She does not know that her father's health is failing, that the war has taken more from him than anyone realizes. She does not know that within 7 years she will be queen. She only knows that she is tired and happy and sad and free, and that tomorrow the cage will close again. The siege is not over. It has only changed shape. The enemy is no longer across the channel. It is time itself, marching forward, carrying her toward a destiny she cannot escape. The romance between Princess Elizabeth and Philip Mountbatten unfolds like a fairy tale, but fairy tales have shadows. They meet again during the war, when Philip is a dashing naval officer serving on destroyers in the Mediterranean. He is handsome in the way of matinee idols, blonde, blue-eyed, with the kind of confidence that comes from surviving war and poverty in equal measure. He is also homeless, effectively, his family scattered across Europe, his sisters married to German nobles with Nazi ties, his father dead, his mother institutionalized. He arrives in Britain with little more than his uniform and his charm. The king watches this young man circle his daughter with the wariness of a father who knows what it means to marry into this family. He has seen what the crown does to people. He has felt it crush his own spirit, day by day, year by year. He does not want that for Elizabeth, but he also knows she has no choice. She is the heir. She must marry someone. The only question is whether this particular someone will strengthen the dynasty or shatter it. Philip understands the stakes. He has grown up in the wreckage of royalty. His uncle was king of Greece, deposed and exiled, his family scattered like leaves before a storm. He knows that crowns are borrowed, not owned. He knows that love is a luxury, not a right. But he loves Elizabeth, or believes he does, and he is willing to pay the price. The price is himself. To marry the heir to the British throne, Philip must renounce his Greek and Danish titles. He must convert from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism. He must become a British citizen. And he must take his mother's family name, Mountbatten, leaving behind the Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg lineage that stretches back into the fog of European history. He is, in effect, being asked to erase himself and become whatever the institution requires. He agrees. What choice does he have? He is 26 years old, in love, and ambitious. He does not yet understand that the institution will never stop demanding pieces of him, that the erasure will continue for the rest of his life. The wedding takes place on November 20, 1947, in Westminster Abbey. The nation is still gripped by post-war austerity, rationing continues, coal is scarce, the winter is bitter. But for one day the grey gives way to colour. Elizabeth's wedding dress, designed by Norman Hartnell, requires 100 war ration coupons, which she cannot legally obtain. Women across the country send her their own coupons, a gift of love from brides to bride. She uses them, and the dress becomes a symbol of shared sacrifice. Philip walks down the aisle in his naval uniform, his medals gleaming. He looks straight ahead, his jaw set. Elizabeth walks toward him, her train carried by 8 attendants, her face radiant but composed. She is 21 years old. She is in love. She does not know that she is also walking toward a life sentence. The king watches from his throne, and those closest to him notice the shadows under his eyes. The war has aged him beyond his years. The stress of the abdication, the weight of the crown, the constant performance of courage, it has all taken its toll. He smokes too much. He worries too much. He sleeps too little. His doctors have warned him, but he cannot stop. There is no stopping. There is only forward. After the wedding, the couple moves to Clarence House, a gracious London residence that becomes their first real home. Elizabeth tries to be a normal naval wife. She shops for groceries. She hosts dinner parties. She waits for Philip to return from his deployments. But normal is not possible. Everywhere she goes, she is watched. Every word she speaks, she is quoted. Every gesture, every glance, every smile is analyzed for hidden meaning. In November 1948, she gives birth to her first child, Charles. He is a healthy boy, third in line to the throne, the future of the dynasty. The king holds his grandson and feels, perhaps, a flicker of peace. The line continues. The siege will outlast him. He does not have long. In 1951, doctors discover cancer in his left lung. They remove the lung, but the cancer has already spread. The king, who never wanted to be king, who stammered his way through speeches and wept in his wife's arms, faces death with the same quiet courage he brought to the throne. He hides his pain from the public, from his family, from everyone except his wife. She never leaves his side. On the night of February 5, 1952, he goes to bed at Sandringham, the country estate where he has always found peace. He is well enough to shoot rabbits that afternoon, to laugh with his gamekeepers, to feel, for a few hours, like the country gentleman he was always meant to be. He kisses Elizabeth goodnight. He tells her he is proud of her. He goes to his room, and in his sleep, his heart stops. Elizabeth is in Kenya when it happens. She and Philip are staying at Treetops, a lodge built in the branches of a giant fig tree, watching elephants and rhinos gather at a waterhole below. It is the first real freedom she has ever known. No courtiers, no cameras, no crowds. Just Africa, wild and ancient, and the man she loves. The news takes hours to reach her. Philip hears it first, and he must tell her that her father is dead, that she is queen, that their lives will never be the same. She takes the news in silence. She does not cry. She does not scream. She sits very still, looking out at the African landscape, and when she finally speaks, she asks only that her plane be prepared. As she descends from the aircraft in London, she is met by Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister again, and a phalanx of officials. They bow to her. She is no longer Elizabeth, the young wife, the new mother. She is the queen, and the cage, which had opened just slightly in the African sun, slams shut forever. The coronation of Elizabeth II on June 2, 1953, is the greatest show the world has ever seen. It is the first to be televised, and millions of people in Britain, in Canada, in the United States crowd around tiny black and white screens to watch ancient rituals unfold in their living rooms. The abbey is transformed into a stage. The peeresses in their crimson robes become a living tapestry, and at the center of it all, a young woman of 27 prepares to become a living symbol. Philip kneels before her first, the first subject to swear allegiance to his queen. He places his hands between hers and speaks the words, "I, Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and faith and truth I will bear unto you to live and die against all manner of folks." He looks up at her, and for a moment they are not queen and consort but husband and wife, sharing a secret in a crowd of thousands. Then the Archbishop of London places St. Edward's crown on her head. The weight of it, 5 pounds of solid gold, encrusted with rubies, sapphires and pearls, settles onto her brow. She feels it pressed down, and with it, the weight of every monarch who has worn it before her, back through Victoria, back through the Tudors, back through the Plantagenets, back to William the Conqueror. She is no longer herself. She is the embodiment of an idea, the vessel of 1,000 years of history. Outside the abbey, the rain falls on the crowds. They have camped for days on the pavements, wrapped in blankets and Union Jacks, drinking tea from thermoses, singing God Save the Queen until their voices give out. When she appears on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the roar is deafening. She waves, her white-gloved hand moving in that precise, measured arc that will become as familiar as breathing. She smiles. She is young and beautiful and theirs. But even as the crowds cheer, the cracks are forming. Philip, who knelt so obediently, is already chafing against his role. He is a man of action, of opinions, of restless energy, and he has been sentenced to a life of walking 2 steps behind. He will be the first to admit that he finds it difficult. He will be heard, in private moments, complaining that he is nothing but a bloody amoeba, a biological footnote attached to the Queen. He will seek outlets, sports, charitable work, the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, but the frustration never fully fades. And then there is Charles, the young Prince of Wales, just 4 years old when his mother becomes queen, watches her leave for months at a time on Commonwealth tour. He is raised by nannies, by grandmothers, by the cold machinery of the royal household. He is a sensitive child, artistic and emotional, and he craves the warmth his mother cannot provide. She loves him, of that there is no doubt, but she is the queen, and the queen belongs to everyone. Charles learns early that he must share her with the world, and that the world will always come first. The 1950s roll on, a decade of recovery and optimism. Britain sheds its empire, India, Pakistan, Ceylon, Ghana, one by one the colonies become nations, and the Queen watches it happen, a witness to the end of the world her father inherited. She adapts. She must. The monarchy survives by evolving, by finding new roles, new purposes, new reasons for being. But evolution is painful. In 1955, the government of Anthony Eden collapses in the wake of the Suez Crisis, and the Queen must navigate the constitutional shoals of appointing a new prime minister. She learns to read men quickly, to trust her instincts, to keep her opinions locked behind the practiced neutrality of her smile. She learns that everyone wants something from her, and that giving too much of herself is the fastest path to destruction. At home, Philip pushes for change. He wants the monarchy to modernize, to open its windows, to let in fresh air. He convinces the Queen to allow television cameras into the palace for a Christmas broadcast, to replace the formal presentations at court with less rigid gatherings, to let the public see them as people rather than portraits. The old guard resists. The courtiers, those anonymous men in grey suits who have managed the monarchy for generations, fight every change with the quiet ferocity of those who know that their power depends on preserving the past. The Queen listens to both sides. She weighs, she considers, she decides, and slowly, incrementally, the palace begins to shift. Not much, not fast, but enough. In 1960, her sister Margaret marries Anthony Armstrong Jones, a photographer, the first commoner to marry a royal princess in centuries. The wedding is televised, and the nation watches a new kind of royal, modern, artistic, slightly bohemian join the family. Margaret, always the wild one, the beautiful one, the one who could have been queen if the rules were different, seems to have found her happiness. But the marriage is doomed from the start, and the cracks will eventually show. Through it all, the Queen endures. She gives birth to 2 more children, Andrew in 1960 Edward in 1964, and tries to balance motherhood with monarchy. She reads state papers in the morning, plays with her children in the afternoon, hosts foreign dignitaries in the evening. She learns to sleep anywhere at any time, on planes and trains, and in strange beds. She learns to smile until her face aches, to wave until her arm tires, to listen until her mind numbs. And she learns to hide. Behind the smile, behind the wave, behind the careful, measured words, there is a woman who has not been asked her opinion since she was 27 years old. There is a mother who cannot attend her son's school plays because she is opening a hospital in New Zealand. There is a wife whose husband chafes against the chains she cannot loosen. There is a person, buried deep, who might have liked to be ordinary. But ordinary is not an option. Ordinary died with her father in a bed at Sandringham on a cold February night. All that remains is the Queen. And the siege, which never ended, tightens another notch. The 1960s arrive with the force of a cultural atom bomb, and the monarchy feels the shockwaves. Beatlemania, the sexual revolution, the satirical boom that gives us Beyond the Fringe, and That Was the Week That Was. All of it conspires to make the ancient institutions seem not just old, but irrelevant. For the first time, openly, people begin to ask the question that will haunt the Windsors for decades. What are they actually for? Prince Philip, ever the modernizer, tries to answer. He throws himself into a frenzy of activity, chairing commissions, making speeches, piloting helicopters, designing polo fields. He is everywhere, doing everything, as if sheer velocity might outrun the questions. But his bluntness, once refreshing, now lands wrong. On a visit to China, he tells a group of British students that if they stay too long, they'll get slitty eyes. The joke falls flat. The press, once deferential, begins to note the gap between the man and the moment. Princess Margaret, meanwhile, becomes the public face of royal dysfunction. Her marriage to Tony Armstrong-Jones, now Lord Snowdon, unravels in full view of the tabloids. They fight, they reconcile, they fight again. She drinks too much, smokes too much, stays out too late. Photographs capture her looking bored at official functions, irritated at her husband, trapped in a life that promised glamour but delivered only gilded confinement. She is the cautionary tale, the proof that royal blood does not protect against ordinary unhappiness. And then there is Charles. He is sent to Gordonstown, Philip's old school in Scotland, a place of cold showers, cross-country runs, and Spartan discipline. Charles hates it. The other boys bully him, steal his things, mock his sensitivity. He writes home pleading to leave, but his father insists he stay. Philip believes in toughness, in resilience, in the character-building properties of suffering. He does not understand that his son is not built for suffering, that the sensitivity he despises is the very thing that might make Charles a different kind of king. The Queen watches from a distance. She is by now a master of distance. She loves her son, but she does not know how to show it. She was raised to suppress emotion, to prioritize duty, to keep a stiff upper lip through every trial. She does not see that Charles is drowning because she has never learned to recognize the signs of drowning in others. She only knows that he must endure, as she endured, as her father endured, as all Windsors endure. In 1969, Charles is invested as Prince of Wales in a ceremony at Carnarvon Castle. He is 20 years old, nervous, trying to look confident in the absurdity of the robes and coronet. His mother places the gold circlet on his head and speaks the words that make him heir apparent in the fullest sense. He looks at her, and for a moment, something passes between them, not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement. They are in this together, bound by blood and duty, whether they like it or not. The ceremony is televised, of course. Millions watch. And for a few hours, the monarchy seems relevant again, rooted in ancient tradition but broadcast into modern homes. But the questions persist, and they grow louder with each passing year. What does the Prince of Wales actually do? What is his purpose? What will he be when his time finally comes? Charles does not have answers. He is still searching, still trying to understand himself, still caught between the expectations of his parents and the longings of his own heart. He falls in love, or thinks he does, with a young woman named Camilla Shand. She is funny, earthy, unimpressed by his title. She rides horses and laughs easily and makes him feel, for the first time, like a person rather than a position. But Camilla is not suitable. She has a past, boyfriends, rumors, a life lived without regard for royal protocol. The palace takes notice. The courtiers, those grey men in grey suits, begin their quiet work of separation. They cannot forbid Charles from seeing her, but they can make it clear that marriage is out of the question. They have other plans for the Prince of Wales. They have a list of suitable girls, aristocratic virgins with unblemished records. and they intend to work through it until they find the right one. Camilla, sensing the impossibility of it all, marries someone else, Andrew Parker Bowles, a dashing army officer with a reputation for infidelity. Charles attends the wedding, smiling through the ceremony, hiding his heartbreak behind the practiced mask of royalty. He does not know that this is only the beginning, that the woman he loves will haunt him for decades, that the institution that separates them now will one day tear itself apart over her. The 1960s end. The 1970s begin. The monarchy lurches forward, battered but intact, still standing while thrones across Europe crumble. The Queen celebrates 25 years on the throne in 1977, and the nation throws a party. Street parties, pageants, fireworks. The Silver Jubilee is a genuine outpouring of affection, a reminder that the bond forged in the Blitz has not entirely dissolved. But the cracks are widening, and no one sees them more clearly than the Queen herself. She stands on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, waving at the crowds, smiling her practiced smile, and she knows that the love of the people is conditional, that it can be withdrawn as quickly as it is given. She knows that her family is fragile, that her children are struggling, that her husband is restless, that her sister is self-destructing. She knows that the institution she has spent her life serving is built on sand. And still she waves, still she smiles, still she endures. Because what else can she do? The 1980s dawn with a new Prime Minister and a new mood. Margaret Thatcher sweeps into Downing Street on a wave of conviction politics, and Britain divides between those who love her and those who loathe her. The Queen, constitutionally bound to neutrality, watches from the palace with the careful detachment of a woman who has now served 8 prime ministers. She has seen them come and go: Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, Douglas Home, Wilson, Heath, Callaghan, and she knows that they are all in the end temporary. She is permanent. But Thatcher is different. She is the first prime minister who seems to regard the monarchy not as an institution to be revered, but as a puzzle to be solved. Their audiences are polite but cool. The Queen, raised on deference, finds Thatcher's certainty unsettling. Thatcher, raised in a grocer's shop, finds the Queen's remoteness baffling. They circle each other like cautious predators, never quite connecting, never quite clashing. The nation notices. Rumors circulate that the Queen is concerned about Thatcher's policies, that she finds her divisive, that the traditional neutrality of the crown is being tested as never before. The palace denies everything, as it always does, but the whispers persist, and they reveal something important. The monarchy is no longer above politics in the way it once was. The siege has breached the last line of defense. And then there is Charles. By 1980, he is 32 years old, unmarried, and the pressure is becoming unbearable. The tabloids speculate endlessly about his love life. Every woman he speaks to is photographed, analyzed, promoted as a potential bride. He dates a series of suitable girls: Anna Wallace, Lady Sarah Spencer, but nothing sticks. He is still in love with Camilla, still meeting her secretly, still hoping for something that cannot be. Lady Sarah Spencer, bright and breezy, introduces him to her younger sister at a shooting party in 1977. The younger sister is 19, shy, beautiful in a way that photographs cannot capture. Her name is Diana. At the time, Charles barely notices her. She is just another aristocratic girl, another face in the crowd. But 3 years later, at another party, he notices. She is different now, more confident, more composed, though still wearing the slightly awkward clothes of a girl who hasn't quite grown into herself. She tells him she's sorry to hear about his great-uncle Lord Mountbatten, recently murdered by the IRA. She says she saw him at the funeral, looking so sad. She says she thought he needed someone to look after him. It is the perfect thing to say. Charles, starved of genuine warmth, of simple human connection, is disarmed. He looks at this girl, this child really, and sees something he has been searching for his entire life: the possibility of love without conditions. The courtship that follows is conducted in the full glare of the media. Diana is photographed everywhere, leaving her flat, arriving at the palace, walking in the park. The press loves her. She is fresh, innocent, untouched by the cynicism of the age. She blushes when photographers call out to her. She looks down, shy and sweet, and the nation falls in love. The palace watches with approval. Here at last is a suitable girl, young, just 20 when they become engaged, from a good family, with no past to speak of. A virgin, they whisper, as if that word still matters in 1981. Perfect, pristine, the ideal vessel for the royal bloodline. What they do not see, what they choose not to see, is the fragility beneath the surface. Diana is not simply shy, she is damaged. Her parents divorced bitterly when she was young, her mother left, and Diana grew up feeling abandoned, unwanted, never quite good enough. She has struggled with eating disorders, with self-harm, with the desperate need to be loved that drives her toward relationships that cannot sustain her. Charles does not see it either, or if he sees it, he misinterprets it as vulnerability, as the kind of softness he has always craved in others. He proposes in February 1981 in the nursery of Windsor Castle, surrounded by the toys of childhood. Diana laughs at the absurdity of it, a proposal in a room full of stuffed animals, but she says yes. Of course she says yes. She is 20 years old, and the most eligible bachelor in the world has chosen her. The engagement interview is a disaster masquerading as triumph. A reporter asks the obvious question, "Are you in love?" Diana answers without hesitation, "Of course." Charles, standing beside her, offers a different response, "Whatever in love means." The nation, watching on television, hears the words and chooses to ignore them. They want a fairy tale, and they will have one, regardless of the subtext. But Diana hears them. She files them away, in that part of her mind where the doubts will grow and fester. Whatever in love means, she will replay those words for the rest of her life. The wedding on July 29, 1981, is the largest television event in history. 750 million people watch around the world. Diana's dress, with its 25-foot train, fills the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral. Charles stands at the altar, waiting, his face unreadable. When she reaches him, he looks at her, and for a moment something flickers in his eyes. Is it love? Is it fear? Is it the sudden, sickening realization that there is no turning back? They speak their vows. They walk back down the aisle, husband and wife. The crowds outside roar their approval. The fairy tale is complete. The prince has found his princess. Even as the bells ring out across London, even as the nation celebrates, the cracks are already forming. Diana, looking at her new husband, sees a stranger. Charles, looking at his new wife, sees a girl who does not know what she has agreed to. And somewhere in a quiet corner of the palace, the Queen watches the coverage on television and feels something she cannot name. Not fear, not hope, just the weary recognition that nothing good lasts, and that all of this will end in tears. The siege is about to enter its most brutal phase, and the weapon that will shatter the monarchy's defenses is already walking down the aisle, smiling through her tears, holding the hand of a man who loves another woman. The fairy tale unravels slowly, then all at once. In the early years of the marriage, the world sees only what it wants to see: the perfect prince, the beautiful princess, the two beautiful sons, William and Harry, born in 1982 and 1984. The photographs are carefully staged, the smiles carefully practiced, the narrative carefully controlled. But behind the palace walls, something very different is happening. Diana discovers the truth about Camilla within months of the wedding. She finds photographs, she finds gifts, she finds the unmistakable evidence of a connection that predates her and will outlast her. She confronts Charles, and he does not deny it. He cannot. He loves Camilla, has always loved Camilla, will always love Camilla. Diana is the price he paid for duty, the sacrifice he made for the crown. She is not his choice, she is his sentence. The marriage becomes a war zone. They fight, they reconcile, they fight again. Diana, desperate for affection, throws herself into her role as mother, as princess, as public figure. She learns that the cameras love her, that the crowds come for her, that she has something Charles will never have: the ability to connect, to touch, to be loved without effort. She uses it, she weaponizes it. Charles, retreating into his world of philosophy, architecture, and organic farming, watches his wife become more famous than he will ever be. The press, once content to report what the palace told them, now splits into factions: Team Charles, Team Diana. The battle for public opinion becomes a war of leaks and counterleaks, of friendly journalists and hostile photographers, of carefully timed appearances and devastating silences. The Queen watches from the throne, and she does nothing. Or rather, she does what she has always done: she waits. She believes that if she ignores the problem, it will eventually solve itself. She believes that duty will triumph over passion, that the institution will outlast the individuals, that time will heal wounds that seem mortal. She is wrong. In 1987, the marriage is effectively over. Charles and Diana live separate lives under the same roof, communicating through intermediaries, appearing together only when the schedule demands. Diana throws herself into charitable work, aids patients, landmine victims, the homeless, and the world falls even more deeply in love with her. She touches people no royal has ever touched. She holds hands with AIDS patients when the world still fears contagion. She walks through minefields when politicians only talk about them. She becomes, in the eyes of millions, the true heart of the monarchy. Charles, meanwhile, retreats further into his world. He writes letters, gives speeches, pursues his passions, but everything he does is compared to her, and everything falls short. He is formal where she is warm. He is intellectual where she is emotional. He is the past, she is the future. The press, never kind to him, becomes openly hostile. In 1992, the dam breaks. Andrew Morton publishes Diana, Her True Story, a biography based on tapes Diana herself secretly recorded and provided to the author. The book reveals everything: the bulimia, the suicide attempts, the coldness of the royal family, the enduring presence of Camilla. The palace denies everything, but the denials ring hollow. The public has chosen its side, and it is not the side of the crown. That same year, photographs emerge of the Princess of Wales on holiday with a man who is not her husband. James Hewitt, a dashing cavalry officer, becomes the face of Diana's betrayal, though those close to her know that she turned to him only after years of rejection. The tabloids go mad. The story is no longer a whisper, it is a scream. And then in November, the scream becomes a roar. Windsor Castle, the ancient fortress that has housed British monarchs for nearly 1,000 years, catches fire. The blaze tears through the state apartments, consuming paintings by Rubens and Canaletto, destroying ceilings by Verrio, reducing centuries of history to ash and smoke. The Queen watches from the courtyard, her face a mask of grief. The castle is not just a home, it is a symbol, and it is burning. The timing could not be worse. Public debate rages about who should pay for the repairs. The government initially offers to foot the bill, but the outcry is immediate and vicious. Why should taxpayers fund the restoration of a palace owned by the richest woman in the country? The Queen, for the first time in her reign, agrees to pay income tax. It is a concession, a recognition that the old rules no longer apply. On November 24, 1992, the Queen stands before a banquet at Guildhall to mark her 40th year on the throne. She is not celebrating, she is explaining. Her speech is brief, her voice steady, but the words she chooses will echo for decades. 1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure, she says. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. The Latin phrase hangs in the air, a horrible year, but even as she speaks it, she knows that the horror is not over, it is only beginning. The siege, which has pressed against the walls for decades, is now inside the gates, and the enemy is her own family. The separation becomes official in December 1992. Prime Minister John Major announces to a hushed House of Commons that the Prince and Princess of Wales have agreed to separate. They will not divorce, not yet, but they will live apart. The fairy tale is dead, and the obituaries are brutal. Diana retreats from public life, or tries to, but the press will not let her go. She is pursued everywhere, photographed through telephoto lenses, tracked by helicopters, hounded by paparazzi who will stop at nothing to capture the next image. She becomes a prisoner in her own city, trapped in Kensington Palace by the wolves at the gate. Charles, too, faces the fury of the press. His phone calls to Camilla are recorded and published, their intimate conversation laid bare for the world to mock. He tells her he wants to be her tampon, a disastrous choice of words that will follow him forever. The public, already inclined to see him as cold and unfeeling, now sees him as ridiculous, the heir to the throne, reduced to tabloid punchline. The Queen watches her son's humiliation and feels the cold grip of a truth she cannot escape. The institution she has served her entire life is failing. The deference that protected it for centuries has evaporated. The press, once respectful, is now openly hostile. The public, once loyal, now demands accountability. And her family, the family she sacrificed everything to preserve, is tearing itself apart in full view of the world. In 1995, Diana strikes back. She agrees to an interview with Martin Bashir for the BBC's Panorama program. It is a decision that will change everything. The palace warns her not to do it. Her friends beg her to reconsider. But Diana, desperate and cornered, believes she has no choice. She will tell her story in her own words and let the world judge. The interview airs on November 20, 1995. 23 million people watch in Britain alone. Millions more watch around the world. Diana sits in a simple black dress, her eyes heavily made up, her voice soft but steady. She speaks of her marriage, her bulimia, her depression. She speaks of Camilla, and then she speaks the words that will define her legacy. Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. The line lands like a bomb. The Prince of Wales, watching in private, feels the ground shift beneath him. The Queen, watching at Sandringham, understands that something fundamental has changed. The monarchy, already wounded, has been struck a blow from which it may not recover. The backlash is immediate. The press, which has spent years courting Diana, now turns on her. She is manipulative, they say, unstable, vengeful, but the public does not turn. The public loves her more than ever. She has spoken their language, told their truth, revealed the pain behind the palace walls. She is no longer just a princess, she is a martyr. In December 1995, the Queen acts. She writes to Charles and Diana, instructing them to divorce. It is not a request, it is a command. The institution must be protected, and the only way to protect it is to sever the connection that threatens to destroy it. Charles agrees reluctantly. Diana agrees bitterly. The divorce is finalized in August 1996. Diana loses her Royal Highness title. She is no longer part of the family. She is on her own. But she is not alone. The world watches her every move. She throws herself into her charitable work with renewed energy. She campaigns against landmines, walking through active minefields in Angola, drawing attention to a cause others have ignored. She visits sick children, holds AIDS patients, touches the untouchable. She is, in the words of the Prime Minister, the people's princess. And then, in the summer of 1997, she falls in love. Dodi Fayed, son of an Egyptian billionaire, is handsome, charming, attentive. They are photographed together on his father's yacht in the Mediterranean. The world watches, and for the first time in years, Diana looks happy, really happy. The photographs show her laughing, relaxed, free. The palace watches too, and the old anxieties resurface. Dodi is Muslim. His father, Mohammed Al Fayed, is a controversial figure who has long sought acceptance from the British establishment. A relationship with Diana, especially a serious one, would bring complications the royals cannot control. But they do nothing. They cannot. Diana is no longer their concern. On August 30, 1997, Diana and Dodi leave the Ritz Hotel in Paris, pursued by paparazzi on motorcycles. Their driver, Henry Paul, is over the legal alcohol limit. He speeds through the Pont de El Alma tunnel, trying to lose the photographers. The car crashes into the 13th pillar. Dodi and Henry Paul are killed instantly. Diana, still alive, is trapped in the wreckage. She is rushed to the hospital, but her injuries are too severe. She dies in the early hours of August 31. The world wakes to news it cannot process. The Princess of Wales is dead. The fairy tale is over, and the monarchy, already under siege, now faces its greatest test. The Queen is at Balmoral when the news reaches her. She is with Charles, with William and Harry, with the family that has been fractured and battered and diminished. She takes the call, listens in silence, and then she must tell her son that the mother of his children is dead. Charles crumples. Whatever their history, whatever their pain, Diana was the woman he married, the mother of his sons, a part of his life that can never be erased. He weeps and his sons weep with him. The Queen watches, and for once she does not know what to do. There is no protocol for this. There is no precedent. There is only grief, raw and overwhelming. In the days that follow, the monarchy makes a catastrophic error. They stay at Balmoral. They keep the boys away from the cameras, away from the press, away from the city that is drowning in flowers and tears. They believe they are protecting them. They believe that privacy is the priority, that the family must grieve in peace. But the nation does not see it that way. The nation sees a queen who will not come to London, who will not speak, who will not acknowledge the tsunami of grief that has engulfed her people. The flags over Buckingham Palace fly at half-mast, but the Queen is not there. The crowds gather, but the palace is silent, and the silence becomes a roar. The press, which hounded Diana to her death, now turns on the family she left behind. Headlines scream their fury, "Show us you care. Where is our Queen? Speak to us, ma'am." The monarchy, so recently wounded by Diana's revelations, now faces a new threat. The perception that it is cold, heartless, indifferent to the suffering of its people. The Queen's advisors beg her to return. Her family begs her to return, but she hesitates. She is a grandmother first, a queen second, and her grandsons have just lost their mother. She will not sacrifice them to the mob. She will not parade their grief for the cameras. But finally, reluctantly, she agrees. She returns to London. She walks among the flowers, reads the messages, speaks to the mourners, and on the night before the funeral, she addresses the nation in a live broadcast. She stands alone in a room at Buckingham Palace, the camera capturing every line on her face, every tremor in her voice. She speaks of Diana, as a remarkable and gifted human being. She speaks of her admiration for her, her respect for her sadness at her loss, and then she speaks the words that matter most. I, for one, believe that there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I share in your determination to cherish her memory. It is not enough, it could never be enough, but it is something. It is an acknowledgement that the old rules no longer apply, that the monarchy must change or die, that the people's grief must be honored even when it conflicts with royal instinct. The funeral on September 6, 1997, is the largest event of its kind in history. Millions line the streets, billions watch on television. Diana's coffin, draped in the royal flag, is carried through London on a gun carriage. Behind it walk her brothers, her ex-husband, her sons. William and Harry, 15 and 12, walk through the staring eyes of the world, their faces pale, their eyes downcast. They are children, and they are burying their mother, and the whole world is watching. At Westminster Abbey, Earl Spencer delivers a eulogy that cuts to the bone. He speaks of his sisters, beauty, and humanity. He speaks of the press that hunted her, the institution that failed her, and he makes a promise that echoes through the ages. We will not let you be swept aside by those who seek to rewrite history. The words are aimed at the monarchy, and everyone knows it. The Queen sits in her pew, her face unreadable. She has been attacked before, but never like this, never in a house of God, never in front of the world. She takes it. She has no choice. The siege is complete. The enemy is everywhere. After the funeral, the family returns to Balmoral. They close the gates, retreat into themselves, try to heal wounds that may never close. William and Harry grow up in the shadow of their mother's death, carrying a grief that will shape everything they become. Charles throws himself into his work, into his charities, into his relationship with Camilla, waiting for the world to forgive him. The Queen returns to her duties because that is what she does, that is all she knows. But something has changed. The monarchy survived the abdication, survived the war, survived the scandals of the 80s and 90s, but it has not survived Diana unchanged. She broke something that cannot be repaired. She revealed the human heart beneath the crown, and once revealed, it can never be hidden again. The siege continues, but now the walls are made of glass, and everyone can see inside. The new millennium arrives with fireworks and fanfare, but for the House of Windsor, the party feels muted. The Queen stands on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, watching the celebrations, and she knows that the world she was born into is disappearing. The 20th century, which began with the British Empire at its zenith and ended with Diana's funeral, has left the monarchy battered but intact. The question now is whether the 21st century will be kinder. The answer, delivered over the next 2 decades, is a definitive no. The early 2000s are a period of careful reconstruction. Charles, still reviled by many for his treatment of Diana, works quietly to rehabilitate his image. He throws himself into his charitable work, his architectural crusades, his organic farming projects. He is seen less as the cold prince and more as the eccentric uncle, a man of genuine passion and peculiar interests. The press, ever fickle, begins to soften. Camilla, once the most hated woman in Britain, slowly emerges from the shadows. She is introduced to the public through carefully managed appearances, standing a respectful distance from Charles, never pushing, never demanding. The public, initially hostile, begins to see what Charles has always seen, a warm, funny, unpretentious woman who makes him happy. In 2005, they marry in a civil ceremony and the world barely blinks. The siege, for a moment, lifts. William and Harry grow into young men shaped by their mother's death. William, the elder, carries the weight of his future with a solemnity that reminds everyone of his grandmother. He is careful, guarded, determined to protect the remnants of his privacy. Harry, the younger, channels his grief into rebellion. The tabloids call him a party prince, a wild child, a disappointment. But those close to him know the truth. He is a boy who lost his mother and never learned how to grieve in public. In 2011, William marries Catherine Middleton, a commoner he met at the University of St. Andrews. The wedding is watched by 2 billion people, a global spectacle that seems to promise a new dawn for the monarchy. Kate is perfect, beautiful, poised, uncomplaining. She is everything Diana was without the complications. She slides into royal life with a grace that disarms even the most cynical observers. The press, hungry for a new fairy tale, anoints her the future queen. But the fairy tale, as always, has shadows. The same press that celebrates Kate's every outfit also dissects her family, her past, her weight, her hair. She learns, as Diana learned, that the cameras never stop. She learns, as the Queen learned, that the price of visibility is eternal vigilance. And she endures, because endurance is the family business. Harry, watching his brother settle into domestic bliss, feels increasingly like the spare part. He joins the army, serves in Afghanistan, throws himself into danger with an urgency that worries those who love him. He is searching for something, purpose, meaning, escape from the grief that has followed him since childhood. He finds it temporarily in the camaraderie of soldiers, the clarity of combat, the simplicity of service. And then, in 2016, he meets Meghan. Meghan Markle arrives like a thunderbolt. She is American, biracial, divorced, an actress on a popular TV show. She is everything the royal family is not: modern, outspoken, comfortable with fame, unafraid of the spotlight. She meets Harry on a blind date set up by a mutual friend, and the connection is immediate and electric. For Harry, Meghan represents escape. She is not bound by the rules of his world. She does not curtsy or defer or disappear. She looks him in the eye and speaks to him as an equal. She listens to his stories of grief and trauma and does not flinch. She holds him in a way no one has held him since his mother died. For Meghan, Harry represents something more complicated. He is a prince, yes, but also a wounded soul, a man searching for meaning. She believes she can help him. She believes she can navigate the complexities of his world. She does not yet understand that his world is a machine designed to consume anyone who enters it. The press at first is enchanted. A biracial American actress, a modern love story, a prince redeemed by love. The headlines are warm, the photographs flattering, the narrative positive, but the warmth does not last. Within months, the tone shifts. Meghan is too outspoken, too ambitious, too Hollywood. Her family, fractured and dysfunctional, becomes a source of tabloid fodder. Her half-sister gives interviews attacking her. Her father poses for paparazzi photographs. The machine of public opinion, which celebrated her arrival, now prepares for her destruction. Harry watches the coverage with growing fury. He has seen this before. He has watched the press destroy his mother, then profit from her death. He has spent his life hatting the photographers who chased her through the Paris tunnel. And now, he sees the same pattern emerging, the same cruelty, the same cynicism, the same willingness to sacrifice a woman's happiness for a headline. He confronts the palace. He demands protection. He asks the institution to do what it failed to do for his mother, to stand up, to fight back, to defend one of its own. But the palace moves slowly, if it moves at all. The courtiers, those grey men in grey suits, counsel patience. They advise silence. They believe that ignoring the problem will make it disappear. They are wrong. In May 2018, Harry and Meghan marry in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. It is a beautiful ceremony, gospel choir, black pastor, the first mixed-race marriage in royal history. The world watches and celebrates. The Queen, seated in the front row, allows herself a small smile. Perhaps she thinks, this is the future. Perhaps this young couple can bridge the divides that have weakened her family for generations. But even as the vows are spoken, the cracks are forming. Meghan's father is not there, too ill and too compromised to attend. Her half-siblings continue their media campaign. The tabloids, briefly silenced by the wedding, resume their attacks with renewed vigor. Headlines call her Duchess difficult. They mock her for closing her own car door, for eating avocado toast, for anything and everything. Harry watches his wife suffer, and something in him breaks. He is no longer willing to play by the old rules. He is no longer willing to sacrifice his family on the altar of tradition. He begins to plan an escape. The escape, when it comes, is swift and brutal. In January 2020, Harry and Meghan announce they are stepping back as senior royals. They will split their time between the UK and North America. They will become financially independent. They will, in their words, carve out a progressive new role within this institution. The announcement is made on Instagram, without consulting the Queen, without warning the family, without the careful choreography that has governed royal communications for centuries. The palace is blindsided. The press is apoplectic. The public is divided. The Queen, now 93 years old, faces the greatest crisis of her long reign. A senior royal, her grandson no less, has publicly rejected the institution she has spent her life serving. He has chosen his wife over his family, his happiness over his duty. It is the abdication all over again, but worse. Edward VII at least had the decency to do it quietly, through official channels. Harry has done it on social media, in full view of the world. The family gathers at Sandringham for what becomes known as the Sandringham Summit. Charles flies in from Scotland. William arrives with Kate. Harry, alone, faces his grandmother, his father, his brother. The meeting lasts for hours. When it ends, a statement is issued. Harry and Meghan will cease to use their HRH titles. They will repay the taxpayers' money spent on renovating their home. They will become private citizens living between Canada and the UK. But private citizenship is not what they want. Within months, they move to California, to the mansion in Montecito, to the world of Hollywood and Netflix and Spotify. They sign a multi-million-dollar deal with Netflix to produce content. They launch a podcast. They give interviews, first to Oprah, then to anyone who will listen. And in those interviews, they tell their truth. The Oprah interview, in March 2021, is watched by nearly 50 million people worldwide. Meghan speaks of feeling silenced, of being denied help when she was suicidal, of a family that cared more about image than humanity. She reveals that someone in the palace, she will not say who, expressed concern about the color of her unborn son's skin. The word racist hangs in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Harry speaks of his father and brother being trapped in the institution. He speaks of his mother, and the parallels are impossible to ignore. He speaks of his fear that history would repeat itself, that Meghan would be destroyed as Diana was destroyed, and he could not let that happen. The palace responds with a brief statement. The issues raised, particularly that of race, are concerning. While some recollections may vary, they are taken very seriously and will be addressed by the family privately. The words are careful, measured, designed to calm rather than inflame, but the damage is done. The siege, which has pressed against the monarchy for nearly a century, has finally breached the inner sanctum. A royal prince and his wife are not just criticizing the institution from the outside, they are building a rival media empire to compete with it. They are telling stories the palace cannot control. They are speaking directly to a global audience that has grown up with social media, with authenticity, with the expectation that power should be accountable. The Queen, now in the final year of her life, watches from Windsor Castle. She is old, tired, grieving the loss of her husband Philip, who died just months before the Oprah interview. She has spent 7 decades serving an institution that her own grandson now describes as a prison. She has sacrificed everything, her childhood, her privacy, her family's happiness, for a crown that may not survive her. And yet she endures, because endurance is all she knows, because duty is all she has left. On September 8, 2022, the longest reign in British history comes to an end. Elizabeth II dies at Balmoral, the Scottish estate where she always found peace. She is 96 years old. She has served as queen for 70 years, through 15 prime ministers, through wars and scandals and transformations that would have destroyed lesser institutions. She dies as she lived, quietly, privately, surrounded by family. The nation mourns, the world mourns. The queues to see her coffin stretch for miles, snaking along the Thames, waiting for hours in the autumn cold. The funeral is a spectacle of ancient ritual and modern media, watched by billions, a final tribute to the woman who embodied the idea of monarchy for generations who knew nothing else. But even in death, the cracks show. The new king, Charles III, delivers his first speech to the nation, and the world watches a man who has waited 70 years for a role he may not be able to fill. He speaks of his mother with genuine grief, of his sons with palpable love, of his commitment to service with the earnestness that has always defined him. But the questions linger. Is he too old, too unpopular, too tied to a past that no longer exists? William and Kate walk behind the coffin, their faces masks of solemn duty. They are the future, and everyone knows it. They have spent years building an image of quiet competence, of modern monarchy done right. William, haunted by his mother's death, has learned to guard his emotions behind a wall of royal reserve. Kate, the commoner who became a duchess, has learned to smile through every trial. They are polished, professional, prepared. Harry walks separately. He is no longer a working royal, no longer part of the family in the way he once was. He wears a suit, not a uniform, a visible reminder of the rift that divides the house. He walks with his cousin, with his uncle, but the distance from his brother is measured in more than steps. The cameras capture every glance, every avoided eye contact, every moment of tension. The world watches the family grieve, and the family cannot hide. In the months that follow, the new reign begins. Charles, finally king, moves quickly to streamline the monarchy. He reduces the number of working royals, cuts costs, modernizes procedures. He is determined to create an institution that can survive in the 21st century, smaller, more efficient, less vulnerable to the scandals that have plagued his family for decades. But the threats keep coming. Harry's memoir, Spare, is published in January 2023. It is a bombshell, intimate, angry, heartbreaking. Harry describes his childhood, his mother's death, his brother's physical attack on him, his father's emotional distance. He describes the institution as a machine that destroys the people it is meant to protect. The book becomes the fastest-selling non-fiction book in history. The palace, once again, is forced to respond. The Netflix documentaries follow 6 episodes of intimate revelation. Harry and Meghan tell their story in their own words, with their own footage, their own narrative control. They are no longer subjects of the media, they are the media. They have built a rival kingdom, and they are winning. William and Kate, meanwhile, continue their work. They visit schools and hospitals, open buildings and greet crowds. They project an image of stability, of continuity, of duty quietly done. The press, hungry for a contrast, anoints them the saviors of the monarchy. They are the future, the headlines proclaim. They will fix what their father and brother have broken. But the questions will not go away. What is the monarchy for? In a world of Netflix and TikTok and Instagram, why should an ancient family, with all its flaws and failures, continue to occupy the throne? What does it mean to be king when the cameras capture everything, when the past is never forgotten, when every member of the family has a platform to tell their own truth? Charles III, the man who waited his entire life for a crown, now wears it in an age when crowns have lost their power. He rules over a fractured family, a skeptical public, a media landscape that feeds on royal blood. He is the last king of an old world and the first king of a new one. And the siege continues. The question that haunts the House of Windsor, as it has for nearly a century, is the question of survival. Not physical survival. The family will endure in some form for generations to come, but institutional survival, cultural survival, the survival of the idea that a single family, by accident of birth, should represent a nation. The arguments for monarchy are well rehearsed: stability, continuity, apolitical leadership, tourism revenue, soft power. The arguments against are equally familiar: inequality, privilege, expense, the absurdity of hereditary rule in a democratic age. Both sides have their truths, both sides have their blind spots. But the Windsors are not an abstraction. They are people, flawed, wounded, struggling people who happen to carry a centuries-old burden. The Queen who sacrificed her childhood for duty, the Prince who waited 70 years for a throne, the Princess who was loved to death, the spare who could not escape his mother's shadow, the American actress who dared to challenge the machine. They are not villains, though they have sometimes played villainous roles. They are not heroes, though they have sometimes risen to heroic occasions. They are simply a family trapped in a golden cage, performing their lives for a world that cannot look away. The cage was built long before any of them were born. It was constructed by history, by tradition, by the accumulated weight of 1,000 years. Edward VI tried to break it, and it broke him instead. George VI tried to bear it, and it crushed him slowly. Elizabeth II learned to live within it, to make peace with its bars, to find meaning in its confines. Charles III inherited it, and now must decide whether to reinforce it or tear it down. His sons represent the two paths. William, the heir, chooses the cage. He accepts its limits, learns its rules, prepares to pass it to his own son. He is the institution made flesh, the embodiment of continuity. Kate, by his side, has learned to smile within the bars. They are the future the palace wants, dutiful, predictable, safe. Harry chose the other path. He broke the cage, or tried to. He walked out into a world that promised freedom but delivered only more scrutiny, more pressure, more demands. He built his own kingdom, his own platform, his own truth. But he cannot escape the past. His mother's ghost follows him everywhere. His brother's silence wounds him daily. His name, his face, his DNA, these things tie him to the cage no matter how far he runs. And Meghan, the catalyst, the lightning rod, the woman who dared to challenge the oldest institution in the Western world. She will be remembered as villain or victim, depending on who tells the story. But she was, above all, human, a woman who fell in love with a prince and discovered that fairy tales are not real. The monarchy will survive in some form. It is too deeply woven into the fabric of British life to simply disappear. But it will not survive unchanged. The siege has transformed it, as sieges always do. The walls are thinner now. The windows are wider. The people inside are more visible, more vulnerable, more human. And that, perhaps, is the legacy of the Windsors. Not the crowns and the carriages, not the palaces and the pageantry, but the humanity beneath it all, the grief of a father who could not save his sons, the loneliness of a queen who could not show her heart, the desperate love of a princess who became a martyr, the quiet endurance of a woman who smiled through 70 years of duty. The siege continues. It will always continue, because the monarchy, by its nature, is under constant assault, from time, from change, from the restless hunger of a world that demands both magic and truth. But as long as there is a Windsor to wear the crown, as long as there is a family willing to bear the weight, the walls will hold. For now,